Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME link in the show notes. Today we welcome Brian Hudes. He's a gastroenterologist. His KevinMD article is titled The Shifting Landscape of Gastroenterology Manpower and Compensation. Brian, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Kevin. Pleasure to be here.
So we'll get into the article in a little bit. First off, briefly share your story and journey.
Well, I went to my internal medicine training and then had interest in GI and liver disease. I did that training at Medical College of Virginia. I had a couple of moves around in my practice and settled down in the Atlanta area and started practicing up until about the 2015 when, with the change of Obamacare, I wound up selling my practice to one of the large groups in town and retiring briefly. And now I'm mostly for GI. I'm doing some shift work or part-time work. I work about 1 to 2 weeks per month doing GI hospital work. My perspective was when I first sold my practice in 2016, there was a demand for GI hospital work or GI locums. The pay was not very competitive. And what I've seen is since that time, in the last several years, that basically the pay scale has doubled. And it really made sense. And it's what led to me writing the article because of what I've seen and talking to other gastroenterologists that I know.
Okay, so let's talk about your article. It's titled The Shifting Landscape of Gastroenterology Manpower and Compensation. So what made you write this article?
Well, what made me write it was just the rising demand for GI coverage at hospitals and in outpatient center. But really, the biggest push has been for the GI hospitalist. Of course, the hospitalist role in the last 20 years has grown dramatically to the point now with no internist really works in the hospital for the most part. And more, we're starting to see that the gastroenterologists and the specialists are doing the same thing because we are in such demand in larger hospitals and we have to be there to do the consults and do procedures. It's just not efficient to really try and run an office practice and go to the hospital and do all those patients. Going back and forth between a hospital and the office, you just lose a lot of time. And so a lot of practices are hiring now GI hospitalists to just cover the hospital. And what I've seen is that the demand is great. And it really starts to make sense when you realize that back in the 90s, when I did my training, we had about 1,000 doctors a year becoming board certified. And last year, we had about 600. Now, the thing about gastroenterology is that as a specialty, it only started with the invention of the first colonoscope back in the early 70s. So the first GI training programs got going in the early 80s. When I came out of my training in 1995, if I went to a GI meeting in the early 90s, there was nobody over the age of 45 because no gastroenterologist had ever retired because there were no old gastroenterologists. There were a few guys in academics, but they didn't scope. And the big push was scoping. And then, of course, the federal government came out and said that, everybody in the country has to have access to colon cancer screening and your insurance has to pay for it 100%. So that increased demand. And then the baby boom hit, which then increased demand. But right around all that time happening, we had Obamacare come out. They made it more and more difficult to practice and have a private practice. Back in the early 2000s, Medicare came out and said, we need to shift these procedures out of the hospital into private endoscopy centers. So we're going to raise the facility fees. So a lot of the gastroenterologists like myself opened up endoscopy centers and we saved Medicare billions with a B, billions of dollars, because we would get paid less than the hospital to do the same procedure as a facility. But it also gave us, an additional income. And that's really how we were making money was by owning the facilities, owning an anesthesia service. Because actually the reimbursement for colonoscopy, Kevin, from 1992, it was $540. Today, it's about $160. So when you count in inflation, it's a 90 to 95% fee cut. So when I was looking at this back in 2015, I talked to my accountant and I said, do you think my practice is worth more today or tomorrow? And with the way that fees were getting cut by Medicare, I said, my practice isn't going to be worth more in 5 years. So I sold and I retired. But it wasn't just me who did that. It was a flurry. If you talk to any of the practice consultants, they were doing all these deals of big groups acquiring small groups, and then the entrance of private equity into the GI market, which is now just flourishing, getting more and more.
Yeah.
But, I think what happened is you had a lot of doctors around who they had done well during the 90s, 80s, early 2000s. Now all of a sudden you get a big lump sum payment, seven figures, and we all just walked away, or we're able to cut back and work less, all at a time when there's fewer gastroenterologists coming out. So plus, as a demographic, now we have gastroenterologists at 65, 70 years old and in their 70s. Well, those guys are going to naturally retire. They have to leave because of health problems. They don't want to work as much. So now we have over 1,000 doctors a year leaving the specialty, but only 600 new ones a year coming out. But the thing is, if you look at the demographic from 1995, when we were a population of 270 million, and now it's more like 330 million in the country, and it's aging, the demand for services skyrocketed. So from 2016 to today, I've seen that the locums tenens rate, the daily rate for coverage, has doubled. It used to be if I asked for a rate, they would say, well, no, we can't really get that. Now they're coming in and offering more than I ever thought that I would get paid. I just got a call today for about 4,500 a day for me to go work in a state out west, which is more than I made owning a practice with an endoscopy center.
Now, how are hospitals and medical institutions, how are they responding to these changing gastroenterology market dynamics?
Well, it's interesting because Medicare and fee schedules have not doubled for GI services. But what the hospitals, I think, have realized is that if I'm not there, they don't get the facility fee, they don't get the anesthesia fee, they don't get the radiology fees for all the tests I would order, and they don't get pathology and lab fees. So they're really having to dip into other resources of ancillary income to pay us. Now, is it reasonable and realistic that this trend will continue? No, because at some point the hospitals are going to have to say, well, we can't pay that, and they're going to have to cut GI as a service that they provide and ship the patients out. But right now they don't want to lose those patients.
And from a patient standpoint, I know that you talked about the shortage of gastroenterologists because of these market dynamics, but just give practical scenarios of how that specifically affects patients. Is it just long wait times for colonoscopies or anything more than that?
Oh yeah, there's very long wait times. I worked up in Marquette for a couple of weeks, and the endoscopy staff told me that they had 8,000 patients waiting for colonoscopies, and they didn't
8,000.
have 8,000 patients waiting for screening colonoscopies
Wow.
because they didn't have enough manpower just to take care of the sick patients. In terms of what people are experiencing, if you call any of the large groups in a significant metropolitan area, it can be several months to get in. And for routine screenings, it can be a long wait. But I think, it's like with everything else in medicine, the gastroenterologists are spending more time scoping, less time in the office. And so now you go in and you have to see a physician assistant, a nurse practitioner. And that's fine if they're going to see you to say, well, we're going to set you up for your colon cancer screening, or if it's something routine. But the reality is, it's like everything else in medicine. When you get the complex liver patient in, or the complex Crohn's and colitis patient in, or the patient with abdominal pain that nobody can figure out what's going on, at some point you need the experience of the gastroenterologist with the training that we have. And now the pharmacology, especially like an inflammatory bowel disease, it's gotten so advanced and complicated, it's hard for us doctors to stay up to date on these things.
You mentioned earlier on about the impact of private equity, and it's affecting so many other parts of medicine, emergency departments, anesthesia. But as it relates to gastroenterology specifically, tell us the impact that private equity has on these practices.
Well, the private equity, they think that they buy up practices because they say, oh, look at the profit margin. Well, that profit margin is not really profit margin, of course, it was the doctor's income. So they think they're going to come in and make the practice more lucrative. Well, they really can't negotiate with the insurance companies. We proved that last time that they did this back in the 90s when some companies got involved. They all went belly up because they couldn't make practices more efficient. The reality is that they're trying to pay doctors less, okay? And they're trying to control the patient flow. They want you to see more patients and have less time, which of course lowers patient satisfaction. The other thing is that if I do, when I did marketing for my practice, I was advanced gastroenterology associate, but I would go around and introduce myself, and I had a one-on-one relationship with my referring doctors, and that was the key to my success. Well, now these private equity companies, they don't want you to market because they don't want it to be that they're sending to Dr. Hudes. They want you to be sending to the practice because, they want to treat the doctors like the cog in a machine that were replaceable. But the reality is that patients have a one-on-one personal relationship and interaction with their physician. And not every patient works with every doctor. Sometimes, I can probably work great with 80 or 90% of the patients, but there's 10, 20% of the patients, we don't click. So for a therapeutic environment, it's not going to work. The private equity companies see that we're just all interchangeable. Well, you're a gastroenterologist. You can see those patients. It's like, well, no, I don't do that really. I mostly do this kind of work. Or, I don't work well with this type of patient. I work better with that kind of patient. And they don't care. They want you to just see everything and everyone, no matter what.
So let's say you're a practicing gastroenterologist now, and you're confronted with these market dynamics that you described earlier. Tell us some of the choices that face gastroenterologists today and what kind of advice that you would give them.
Well, to today's gastroenterologist, I think that, as an individual, you have to remain flexible and independent. You have to be very careful about the contract that you're signing. Everyone's talked about restrictive covenants. In this market with the shortage, you should not be signing a restrictive covenant. That's just ridiculous, number one. Number two, you have to be thinking about to yourself, is working for somebody else, and at the end of the day, you have your 401k and your savings, and that's it. You've built no equity. What made me able to walk away when I was 52 was that I owned the building that I was in. And when I sold my practice, I signed a lease on my building, and so they're leasing it. And then I was able to play real estate and take the equity from my building and buy another building, and then buy another building, and then start to venture out because I had passive income coming in. Now I work not because I have to, I work because it's what I want to be doing. And part of it is I feel responsible that I have, all these years of experience doing what I do. I mean, literally 40 or 50,000 procedures under my belt, and expertise and an ability to treat people. That I don't want to walk away 100% from contributing back what I've learned. But at the same time, I can now do it on my terms. Mm-hmm. I work when I want to work. And what does that mean? I'm a happier doctor. I have the time to actually have work-life balance. A lot of the young doctors that they want work-life balance. And my response to them is, the work-life balance that you chose is to be a doctor, and you have to be committed early in your career to absorb as much experience and knowledge, interacting with your senior doctors in the area, having the time to actually see patients and work with them in a linear fashion over time to see how they respond. The insurance companies and private equity, they want us to work based on a formula. They say, well, according to this study, it's like, well, that study worked in 82% of patients. What about the other 18%? These organizations forget people are individuals, they're not populations, so studies don't always apply to individuals. We have to sit and talk to that patient. Yeah, this treatment might be the best for that patient theoretically, but will the patient be compliant with taking a medication 3 times a day? Or somebody needs to be on something once a day or once a week, or they don't have access to get an injection, or they don't have access to this expensive new fancy medicine. We need to start with something less expensive. So that's where being a physician, the art of medicine comes in. And doctors have to be able to retain that independence. And so you have to recognize your value that, hey, I am a gastroenterologist. It takes a long time to make one of me, and it takes a long time to get the experience to be good at what we're doing. And I have to remain independent so I can treat people the way I believe as a physician I should be treating. because I'm a doctor, I'm a physician, I am not a provider.
And my final question, Brian, tell us some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
Be smart, be independent, be willing to move for a better opportunity. Do not put up with a non-physician telling you how to practice.
Brian, thanks again for coming on the show, sharing your perspective, time, and insight.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate the opportunity.